In my last video, I got stuck trying to pull the cylinder head mounting bolts off, and really all I needed was a 12-point M10 socket.
I'm definitely making progress on pulling these cylinder head bolts out, but the problem is I don't really have a stand, and I'm just trying to work with these wood blocks here, so I am really fighting this thing. These bolts are torqued down hard, and every time I go to try and break them free, I wind up spinning the motor. So, yeah, I'm just going to put up with a fight, but I think if I were to ever do this again, I would try and find some sort of motor stand to make this much, much easier. The reason I pulled the camera off of the tripod was I'm about to pull the last bolt off, and there's this camshaft sensor in the way, so just wanted to point out that you need to actually loosen this bolt and pull the camshaft sensor out, and then you can go ahead and take that bolt out.
So I fought this thing hard, and as I was doing it, I kind of realized that when I go to reassemble the motor, I'm going to have to get really specific torque values, and there's no way I'm going to achieve that if the motor is spinning and I can't get good leverage. So I'm without a doubt going to buy an engine stand for the reassembly. These dental picks, you can pick them up at any hardware store. They're really useful for fishing small things out of tight places. With the cylinder head off, it's usually a convenient time to go ahead and inspect the mating surface and the gaskets themselves for any damage.
The cylinder head is officially off. I did have a little bit of a rough time. You had to manipulate these camshaft chain guides a little bit with your thumbs to get them to come out properly through this opening here. Other than that, though, it came off pretty good. I thought it was weird because the head gasket actually split in half as I was pulling it off. This is the upper part, and there's still, you can see the lower part of the gasket is still sitting on the block. So I don't know why that happened. I think it's a little weird, but other than that, everything came off beautifully. Something interesting, cylinder number 2 here, and this is a cylinder that had the bent valve and the destroyed valve guide. The valve guide literally shattered, and you can see these are all pieces of the valve guide sitting right here. So yeah, that's not good. I'm expecting that I'll definitely have some machine work to do on cylinder 2. I hope it's just a matter of rehoning, but right now I'm almost thinking I have to get it replated, which is not good. If that's the case, I might just get a whole new cylinder block, because that Nicosil plating is really expensive, and if I had to do that, it would pretty much total the case. If you guys saw my last video, you know that we saw one of these retainers right around there. There was a whole lot of metal debris, and that was actually this valve here, and I'm still seeing, you might be able to see chunks, more metal chunks down there. So before I do anything with this head, I want to make sure I account for all of those metal chunks. So I'm just going to take a magnet here and go and continue to pull these pieces, the keepers, out.
Again, all I'm doing here is just pulling debris out of the cylinder head. My best guess is that these are pieces of keepers that were destroyed once the valve bent. And this chunk here is actually a piece of the valve guide. I didn't pull it out of the head. I found it in the air box, so it shot up through the intake manifold and it literally was rattling around my air box. What you're seeing here is me labeling where the cylinder head mounting bolts came from. I'm also going to measure them to determine if any bolt is outside of the average, and if it is, I'm going to replace that bolt. The rest of the sequence is really just pulling things off the cylinder head so that I can start to scrub it. Right now you're looking at me taking off the throttle body holders, and they were really hard to get off. For one, they were a Torx driver, which I hate, and I didn't know this at the time, but they were red thread locked on. I wanted to take this opportunity to show you guys how bent the valve actually was. It's literally no longer assembled. It's that bad. This part of the teardown is always really fun. If you listen closely, you can hear a real satisfying ping every time the magnet grabs one of those buckets. If the shim doesn't come up with the bucket, make sure you grab the shim out of the retainer and keep it with that bucket. This is also the part of the teardown where it starts to get really tedious, because you're basically doing every single thing 16 times, once for every single valve. To respect your time, I'm going to speed this up, but I'm not going to cut any of it out. I really want to demonstrate how much is involved with a valve job. All of the buckets and shims have been removed, so now I can start to go ahead and pull the valve assemblies apart one at a time. The way I'm going to do that is by compressing the spring, and that means pushing down on this retainer while holding the valve from the other side. That's going to loosen these split keepers in here and allow me to pull them out with a magnet. With those keepers out, everything else will literally just fall apart. Those keepers are the only thing holding all of this together. Here I'm setting up the first valve to be pulled out, and I've actually got the keepers out here, and you can see they're literally just two halves of a conical shaped cylinder. I've got one of them removed, and I really wanted to document for myself that there's definitely a correct way to orient the spring when I reassemble. If you notice the bottom of the spring, each coil is wound closer together, whereas at the top there's more space in between each coil. I'm just going to keep going on with disassembling these valves, but I wanted to make a point of letting you guys know how important it is to have the right tool for this job. I've done it before with just some pliers by compressing the retainer with the pliers and somehow trying to fish the keepers out with a magnet in my other hand. It's not worth it. You'll save yourself a lot of time and headaches if you just go ahead and buy the right tool. This one is a Pit Posse spring compressor, and I absolutely love it, but a quick Amazon search will turn up plenty of other suitable options. With all the valves removed, the next step for me is to pull the oil seals out. There was one valve I couldn't get out, and that's the damaged valve, of course, so I won't be able to pull that oil seal off either, but my plan is just to have the machine shop take care of that since he's going to replace the valve guide anyways. Now I've got an obligation to warn you guys that what you're about to witness me do is not the proper way to pull the oil seals off. I don't have oil seal grippers small enough for these small motorcycle engines, so an alternative for me is going to be using some pliers and yanking them straight up and out. The only reason I feel okay about doing this is because the service manual and good practice dictates that anytime you have the cylinder head disassembled to this level, you may as well just go ahead and replace the oil seals, because over time those oil seals will start to wear down. So good practice is to just replace them while you have the opportunity. One other important note that I really have to make is that if you choose to pull these off with pliers, make sure you're absolutely careful, because you do not want to scratch these valve guides. The last thing we need to do is take the spring seats out, and they're those small little metal discs that are sitting at the base of each spring. You really want to take them out so that when the machinist has the cylinder head and while you're cleaning it and things like that, these can fall out. So it's better to just pull them out and keep track of them that way so that you can put them back in and you won't have any surprises when you start to reassemble. You'll see me starting to pull the valve cover gasket off, and I am going to saran wrap it and save it for later because there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. And this is the one gasket, the one and only gasket that I consider a pretty low risk to reuse, considering how much they cost to replace. With everything else off of the cylinder head, it's time to start cleaning. Now you'll notice I'm using acetone here, and personally I found that it takes leftover gasket material right off. And I really prefer that method because I've done it with the razor blade and the scraper before. And the problem I have with that method is, while it works, it's also really easy to scratch the mating surface of the cylinder head, which is something you absolutely do not want to have happen. This is another spot where I'm obligated to let you know about something I'm doing. That can of Berkebiol gum cutter basically dissolves carbon on contact, and it makes real short work of pulling carbon off. As you can see, with very minimal effort, I was able to take most of that grime off of the cylinder sealings. What you don't see is that every time I use that stuff, I take serious precautions. I open doors, turn fans on, and I'm never more than 5 minutes working on something because I basically want to evacuate the area and let that stuff air out. With everything all nice and clean and torn apart, we come to the really critical part of the valve job, and that's measuring pretty much everything that you can measure based on what the service manual gives you. The first part of this process is measuring the cylinder head warp, which is essentially determining how flat the cylinder head is. We make this measurement by taking a feeler gauge with a size based on the service manual's service limit for cylinder head warp, and we try and stick that feeler gauge in between the cylinder head and a straight edge in various places around the cylinder head. Thankfully in my case, there is no cylinder head warp. You may have seen that a feeler gauge did actually pass through, and the reason for that is because I used a smaller service gauge so I could see and feel what it looked like when that actually happened. If you do happen to pass through in between the cylinder head and the straight edge while using the value specified by the service manual, that means more than likely you have some cylinder head warp and you're going to have to take it to a machine shop and have the cylinder head decked. This next measurement involves the valve seats, which is where the valve actually makes contact with the cylinder head. The first thing I'm going to do is measure the outside diameter of the seat, then I'm also going to measure the thickness of each seat. I'm using a magnifying glass and a light here just so I can try and get a little bit more accuracy out of my measurements. One important thing to note is that every time I make a measurement, or any kind of just observation even, I'm going to mark that down and record it on a piece of paper. It's really important to take those notes for a number of reasons. One being that when you do take the cylinder head to the machine shop, you can show the machinist the notes and you can ask any questions. It's also nice because if you ever tear down the cylinder head again, you have some kind of reference so you can see how much things have worn over time. This might sound kind of bad, but another reason I like to take the notes is that I can shut my brain off while I'm taking the measurements. I can just write down my results and then I can do the analytics after the fact, which keeps me focused 100% on getting the measurements.
Here I'm using a ball gauge to measure the diameter of different points throughout each valve guide. So I'll measure the top, the middle, the bottom, and then maybe just a couple other times through there to average it out. And with the ball gauge, you don't actually get the reading off the ball gauge. You have to use a micrometer on the end of the ball gauge to figure out how far the ball has opened up, and that reading is going to give you the diameter. Now that I've measured everything I need to measure on the actual cylinder head, I'm going to coat it in WD-40 for the water displacement. That's important because the aluminum will corrode almost immediately, especially if I wrap it up in plastic. Now this is the last measurement I'll be taking for the cylinder head, and it's pretty simple. Just measure the diameter of the valve stem. And this is important because earlier you saw me measuring the diameter of the valve guide. So with the valve guide diameter and the valve stem diameter, we'll be able to figure out the clearance between the two. And that's a limit in the service manual.